When I took a macroeconomics course in college, I was taught that human beings are basically trying to do one thing and one thing only, which is to maximize satisfaction under constraints, which is to say, get as much good stuff as possible, given what I've got and what I'm willing to spend. Given the amount of money I have, what's the best way I can spend that money? Given limited time, what's the best way to spend my time? Given my talents, my abilities, my looks, my connections, how can I use all of that to get as much as I can out of life? Today, we are going to chat with behavioral economist Matt Nagler, who has been a good friend of mine since 7th grade. And we're going to talk about a different view of economics. And it's not a new view, it actually is pretty old. It goes back to Adam Smith, who's regarded as the founder of modern economics, the invisible hand, the ruthless arm of capitalism. But as we'll see, Adam Smith had a lot of other things to say about what makes a good life. And economics is slowly folding that back in. And why does this matter to us as individuals? Why do I bring this onto the podcast? Because it's not that we follow this rule in our lives, because we don't. It's that we think we should and we think other people do. And sometimes we get caught up in various rat races and various keeping up with the Joneses. And there's so much evidence that a good life is not based on getting as much of whatever as possible. In fact, getting too much satisfaction can actually be counterproductive. So I'm very excited to have this conversation and to share it with you. So without further ado, Matthew Nagler, welcome back to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thank you, Howie. It's great to be back again.
Yeah, this is our third time in a couple of months, I think.
Yeah, it is.
So you're getting to be a habit.
I think we talked about habit formation on the last podcast, actually.
Yeah, well, it's your fault. You keep publishing these really interesting articles on Substack. And not only are they interesting and useful, but they're well written. So it's very hard to ignore them.
Thank you. I'm trying to get them out about once a month now. And so, when you do that, they're not always going to be that great because, sometimes you're like, now you feel like you're struggling to meet a deadline but every so often, like this one, I really, this one about economics, I don't know. I felt like this was one of the big idea ones that I wanted to get out there. And, basically, bite the hand that feeds me, if you will.
Well, I'm trying to do a newsletter once a week. And honestly, I'm just happy if it's not like a steaming pile by the time it goes out. Once a month sounds very, very, very doable, but I still know myself. I would probably wait till the 29th
right,
to start writing.
Yeah. What happened with this one is I actually got it out a week early because I was so motivated to do this. I don't know, for some reason I was so psyched up about it. I was like, no, let me get this out sooner. And then I realized if I did that, though, the downside was that I was kind of ratcheting back the next one I was going to have to do because it was going to be, if I want to stick with the once a month. Now it's got to come out a week earlier. So here I am. It's like, what is it now? Mid-June. And I'm kind of on the hook for another one in about maybe 10 days.
Oh, so, you got an idea you're working on?
I do. Yeah. I'm working on one that was inspired by Billy Joel's song, Closer to the Borderline. I don't know if you remember that one. It's definitely not one of his best songs. And
what album's that from?
It's from Glass Houses. It's probably one of the lesser songs on Glass Houses.
Okay. Yeah.
So that album, that's a 1980 album. And what Billy Joel is doing, and I don't want to give too much of this piece away, and it's also not entirely written yet, so I'm not sure what I'm giving away. But it was a 1980 album. And what Billy Joel did in that song, which a lot of artists were doing right then, is basically kind of venting malaise. Because remember, that was like the late 70s, 1980 kind of time. And everybody was like annoyed about inflation and interest rates and stuff like that. And so this was Billy Joel's song about all of that.
Gotcha. So akin to Allentown.
Yeah, that's a little bit different. That is kind of, I think of that one as kind of more a working man's Rust Belt song, which can be which can be written a lot of different ways. And there's folk singers who've done a lot of that kind of thing too. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't really have a political bent to it, but the kind of cri de coeur, if you will, that Billy Joel kind of puts out and closer to the borderline is maybe leaning a little bit more to the right. And there was other bands that were doing similar things at the time, like Rush did that, and Styx had a song like that. I mean, a lot of people were. It was the malaise. It was kind of, it was kind of what, I don't know, essentially got Reagan elected then.
Yeah, Morning in America.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm trying to remember where I went with this. So I used that. That kind of inspired me to write this piece, because what was interesting to me about it was that Billy Joel. So I was, of course, when I got this album, I was 14, and I would just, as soon as I got the album, I would just look at the record sleeve and I'd learn all the lyrics. And so the interesting thing, which I noticed because I was actually reading the lyrics on the record sleeve, was that the lyrics to this song on the record sleeve departed from or Billy Joel, rather, when he sang it, departed from what was on the record sleeve. So at one point in the song, the record sleeve says, I'd start a revolution, but I don't have the time. And what Billy Joel actually sang is, I'd start a revolution, but I don't know why. Oh. And so the whole inspiration for this piece is, what's the difference between those two? It's the difference between, in the first case, facing a constraint, a binding constraint, something that economists understand well. It's like, I don't have the time, I can't do it. And the other one is not knowing what your preferences are. I don't know why, Yeah. And so the piece is really about not knowing your preferences, not knowing what you want.
I would argue that they're the same thing when it comes to time, because time is a constraint that you get to play with, right? Like, I don't have time means there's things, it's almost a cynical throwaway line. Like, I just wrote a song that bought me 3 new motorcycles. So anyway, let's talk about that another time. I want to talk about this month's.
Yeah, let's talk about this month's. Right.
So the headline is Economics Has It All Wrong.
Yeah.
So what's the it?
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of throw a bomb there. But the it is this. So it's the idea that what people want to do to be happy is to maximize something subject to constraints. So this is the economists' model. Individual behavior is essentially a problem of maximizing subject to constraints. And the usual constraint that's implied here is a budget constraint. So since economists are talking about economic matters, we're usually talking about people having a certain amount of money and saying, okay, given the amount of money I have to spend, what's the best I can do with this? And so economists think sort of the consumer problem or the individual problem is about doing that, getting the most stuff that you can, or the most satisfying stuff that you can, things or services, subject to your limited money. Okay. And, but another way to look at it also is you can say, hey, I've got a limited amount of time because I'm immortal. And so my problem is to do the most I can with my life, the most satisfying things, pack as much in as I can, subject to that time constraint. And so what I argue in this piece is that this framing is completely wrong. If you go about your life maximizing subject to constraints, it's not a recipe for happiness. And in fact, I'm not saying that, my point is not that I think that people in industrial societies actually do this necessarily. But economists seem to think that they do, and if that's what people do, these are not happy people. So it's kind of a bit of a head scratcher as to what economists have in mind when they do that sort of thing.
Yeah. So since you're an economist, I want to mine that for all it's worth before we get to the philosophical parts that I can actually contribute to. Where did this notion come from? Like, we blame everything on Adam Smith, but Adam Smith, as we've talked about, was far more complex and humanistic than the sort of Chicago School of Economics gave him credit for. So where did this idea come from that came to dominate? Certainly when I took Econ 101, we had the supply-demand curve, and that was based on this idea. that everyone's trying to maximize something.
Yeah, and that's in fact something that I teach when I teach intermediate microeconomics. I kind of explain where the demand curve comes from, and it actually comes directly from this. If you're going to build it up from first principles, you build it up from the assumption that consumers all maximize their utility. We use that term utility, subject to their budget constraint. So where does that come from? That's a good question. Which economist is responsible for that? When in doubt, if you don't know which economist was responsible for it, it was probably Paul Samuelson, if we use it in modern economics. So I think that's quite possible. Although it may go back to somebody a little bit older, like Marshall or Pigou or somebody like that. Although Pigou is mostly responsible for things in public finance like taxation.
I'm now recalling things. So I think my professor in Econ 101 was Alan Blinder, and I think the textbook author was Samuelson. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds right. And in fact, Samuelson was probably still alive then, but the first edition of his textbook was quite a bit earlier than when you're referring to, and so then he was probably in the nth edition of this, and. But Paul Samuelson had the go-to microeconomics textbook for decades. And the interesting thing is that he's not just a textbook author, but he actually developed a lot of this modern stuff himself. And which is fascinating because I don't think he got the Nobel Prize. I'm not remembering that. It's possible he did, but I don't think he did.
So what's the kind of the intellectual soup that came out of? And maybe you're not a historian of economics as much as an economist, but I'm trying, what would they have learned in the 1920s or the 1880s if someone was if someone took economics or whatever it was called back then as a subject?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but I can say this. There were so the interesting thing is you mentioned, let's go back to Adam Smith just briefly at least. So when most people think of Adam Smith, they think of The Invisible Hand, right? They think of The Wealth of Nations, which is the book he's most famous for. It's a 1776 book that is considered to be kind of the original text on economics. And this is a book, the main premise of which is that people are self-interested, and that if everybody behaves in a self-interested fashion, then in a decentralized way, the best outcomes will occur. Okay, without needing government or intervention. So, of course, most people point back to that as argument for why the market works. But of course, as you know, and as you were alluding to, Adam Smith was not that one-dimensional kind of person that he's believed to be. He also wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and he's quite a philosopher. And so he really understood that people were, that they had depth, they had real, sort of feelings and emotions, and they were very, very driven by a lot of psychological things that maybe economics sometimes brushes to the side. Now, so the interesting thing was, that was, I think, actually the dominant way of thinking, recognizing that people had these emotions that were important in understanding their decision making, all the way up until the early 20th century. So if you ask, what you would have learned if you were learning about economics in Victorian times, you'd probably have been learning that people, have these passions, and they have a desire to, pursue pleasure and to avoid pain. Okay. And that is a large part of understanding how people behave as economic actors. So the interesting thing is that behavior really entered into economics for a long time until around mid-century, around World War II, it was kind of all pressed out of economics. And that was basically when Paul Samuelson and his contemporaries rewrote the textbooks. They said, let's kind of simplify this down to an idea of a rational man who is optimizing. Okay. And so what kind of optimization will this rational man do? Well, if he's a consumer, he is going to, I'm sorry, I'm using the male pronoun here, just because they would have.
He was in a gray flannel suit for sure. Rational man.
That's right. The rational man was wearing a gray flannel suit. Yeah. So he's going to maximize his utility subject to a budget constraint. So that's what the consumer does. And a firm maximizes profits. Okay. And so, so those are sort of the two canonical models of behavior and decision making for the consumer on the demand side and the firm on the supply side. And once you have that, you can build everything else up from that. So really, again, the point I want to make here is that does not go back hundreds of years. It's relatively new. I mean, this was created middle of the last century. And so it's, so now behavioral economists are trying to bring the psychology back into economics, but that psychology was there and it hasn't been gone for that long.
That's really interesting how the dominant paradigm also includes rewriting the past. I was talking with a friend from college who visited last week, who is the curator of a museum in Germany it's a math physics museum that houses some of the oldest astronomical instruments and navigation instruments in the world. And I was asking him about, the Copernican revolution and Columbus, this idea that, disproving that the earth is round or operating on that basis. He says, everybody knew the earth was round at that point. The flat earth thing was made up in the mid 19th century by anti-religious people in Europe who were trying to paint the Catholic Church as backwards.
Fascinating. Anti-religious people. I would never have guessed.
Yeah. So here we are again. So, I mean, I'm thinking about things like, the difference between, say, a romantic era and an era of factories and mechanization and commodification. But it also, I'm also thinking about Darwin, and I'm wondering how Darwinism might have played in with this huge idea that, of course, was simplified when it came into when it was applied to human beings. That there's this innate biological drive to maximize something. Yeah.
No, it's interesting. I haven't really thought about that, but it wouldn't surprise me if the ideas of Darwin somehow played into this notion of self-interest. Although, if you look at the literature on altruism, on this idea of, is there an interest beyond the self? To what degree do humans and other organisms take an interest in other, organisms other than themselves? And if you start digging into the literature on altruism, which I did recently, thinking it was mostly going to be an economics literature, very quickly you find your way into evolutionary biology. And so a lot of the work is on, by evolutionary biologists sort of saying, okay, to what extent is it consistent with survival of the fittest to not always put your own fitness first? And the set of situations for non-human organisms in which this is true is quite limited. So we find that individuals generally have to look out for themselves, not just themselves, but their close kin. So self-interest is limited to kin groups, to where there's a lot of similarity in the genetic material. If you're looking out for other organisms that have your genetic material or something very close to it, then you're going to be able to propagate your own genes. And then that's all consistent with survival of the fittest. Now with humans, though, it's a little bit different because there are more complex things going on with humans. There are social mechanisms, social systems that we have that enshrine, for example, reciprocity. So like if we have a norm by which if you do something good for me, I am impelled to do something good back, then that can support quote unquote altruistic behavior. Because if we're going to, if you can count on that kind of support from someone else by doing something for that person, then both of you, you will have your genes protected and propagated, right? So it's interesting how altruism is kind of more expanded for humans. But anyway, this was a bit of a digression, I guess, because we were talking about sort of the relationship of Darwinism and this idea of the self-interested human. And I think I definitely think there's a relationship there. Although the for me at least, the most interesting aspects of that are sort of understanding the scope for altruism.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about it in terms of the church. kind of telling people that you should be good. And this Darwin idea was like, no, actually, which was taken up by, the American eugenics movement, which Hitler studied intensively
Sure.
before applying it in Germany. This idea that, and whole Ayn Rand, virtues of selfishness, that there was this idea, well, you could be good, but you're a sucker, or you can be good, but you're fighting against your nature. And that this, what I'm hearing from Samuelson and from the economists writ large is human nature is we are selfish, and therefore when we plan for the future, or when we model things, or when we create systems, that we want to take that into account and make that assumption, and something of that must have trickled down. Like I'm imagining that people became more like that after it was enshrined in Economics 101 than they had been before, but I don't know that to be true.
Yeah, I kind of wonder that myself, and it's actually something that concerns me in my current work, is thinking to what degree is life imitating art here? I mean, and you can see some of this kind of feedback going on, especially during the 1980s when self-interest was really kind of the hot thing. Okay. I mentioned it in this piece, actually. I mentioned that I had a sweatshirt. I actually did, that said, the one who dies with the most toys wins. And I got this shirt not because I really believe that, but because it was the 80s, and it was like, this was the meme of the 80s, the one who dies with the most toys wins. And wearing this was kind of really hip, because it was like saying, yeah, sure, everybody's selfish. Yeah, don't you know that? But the thing is, of course, then we had things like the movie Wall Street, which now everybody continues to quote Gordon Gekko, Michael Douglas's character, saying greed is good, right? Greed works. Okay. So where did he get that from? Where did the 80s, pick this up? I think, to some degree they picked it up in their economics classes. And, so we, the economics profession, I don't know if I want to take credit for this, but I think we have some responsibility for that. And so if we in fact instead said, or showed with our work, with our research, that being altruistic is actually not being a chump, but being, in some way good, some way smart, I think that might change the way people look at it. And it's interesting because this is part of the topic of my current research. I'm actually doing research right now, experimental research, associating altruism with performance in market environments.
So what does that look like? I always wonder, like, economists and mathematicians, like, how do they do research? Do they just sit there with a whiteboard and wait for symbols to come? Like, what does experimental research look like, to answer that question?
Yeah. So that first thing you mentioned with the whiteboard, that's part of what economists do. That's called theory. Okay. And I'm kind of actually sad. Theory has actually got less of a role in the economics profession than it used to. I love theory. I think that that theory has a lot of usefulness because it helps us to kind of organize our ideas about how things should work so that we can then think about testing them. And when we create concepts, we sort of create the notions of how things work that then are the basis for everything else. So I think theory should have a role, but actually you see a lot less published theory than you used to. And partly this has to do with how easy it is now to do empirical work. So what else do economists do other than just work with a whiteboard? Well, you can get existing data. Like there's all kinds of sources of economics data that you can get from governments, from the private sector and so forth. Then you can use that data to do analyses and see kind of what variables affect what other variables, using a technique called econometrics. Okay. So that's one kind of research that a lot of people do, but an increasingly growing area of economics is experimental research, where in a laboratory or online, you can set up a controlled situation where you can tweak something. You can, in other words, get an experimental group and an identical control group, and you can treat them differently and see what the differences are in terms of how they respond.
Mm. And who are these people?
Oh, who are the people that we use in the experiments?
Yeah.
ideally just sort of people chosen at random from a population. I mean, with very few limitations. Because if you want to understand how people are behaving in the wild, you don't want to constrain that too much. Now, a lot of experiments, especially the ones that are done in laboratories for convenience reasons, have involved students. Okay. So you'll see a lot of, you're laughing. So you see a lot of papers where they say, we ran, 300 University of Minnesota students through this particular thing where we divided them in half and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Or, just to use a specific example, when Richard Thaler did his famous endowment effect experiment in 1980, I think it was. 1980,
was that with the pottery, like mugs and stuff?
Yeah, it was with mugs. Anyway, it was Cornell students. Okay, so he just took a bunch of Cornell students, and I'm forgetting now whether it was 1980 or 1990. but I was not one of those students, although I was at Cornell during that time. Yeah. And but yeah, he recruited Cornell students, and he gave half of them mugs and the other half didn't get mugs. So there was this control group and a treatment group, and he wanted to see how they were going to, or in this case, see how they valued the mugs differently. This was exactly, it wasn't really so much control and treatment, but people with mugs and people without mugs, how do they value the mugs differently?
All right. And just to remind us, what was the insight that came out of that experiment?
Oh, yeah. So the endowment effect is the phenomenon that Thaler uncovered, and that is the finding that there was a systematic difference between the amount that somebody is willing to pay for something and what they would be willing to accept at minimum to part with that thing once they have it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And classic economics would say the numbers should be exactly equal.
It should be exactly equal. There should be one number, which is your valuation of.
So in other words, if there's a mug and I own the mug, mm-hmm. and you say, I want to buy it from you, and I say, I'll sell it for $5, then if I see that mug, I should, and I want it, I should be willing to pay like almost $5 for it.
Yeah. I mean, one reason that we randomly assign people to these two groups, and that's a typical experimental procedure, is because on average, there's going to be sort of an average valuation of the mug, right? Maybe it's $5. And so if you randomly assign people to two groups, their average valuation should be about the same. So if we see a systematic difference, it's because of the treatment that we're doing. And in this case, the treatment is to give some of the mugs and not to give some other people mugs.
All right. So I experienced that recently. So I play paddle and ultimate frisbee here, and it's very sunny in Spain. So nobody told me this, but it's very sunny, and my performance was really suffering because of the sun. And so I decided to splurge. I'm very vain. I want to look good when I'm playing, and so I splurged on like 130 euro Oakley sunglasses, sports glasses that were amazing. Uh-huh. And then 2 weeks ago, I went over my handlebars on my bicycle, and I was fine, but my glasses got scratched, and I am like I haven't used them that much, but like the first thing, like I feel lessened.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm missing something. And every time I walk by an optometrist or a sunglass store or a lens shop or frame shop, I'm like, I want to go in and replace them.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I'm seeing a couple different things here. So like one thing is you probably felt worse after you lost the glasses than before you acquired them, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We call that loss aversion. Okay. So just the simple example that we always give students is like, imagine how you'd feel if you found $20 on the sidewalk and then, an hour later you find that you've lost it. You feel like you're worse off than you were before the whole thing started. So you experience that. But then the other thing that happened there was what I think of as either an ownership effect or motivated preference, that because you had a period of time when you owned the Oakleys, you grew accustomed to them and they increased in value for you from after the initial purchase, such that when they were gone, you really felt their lack. So you developed a complementarity towards them, whether consciously or unconsciously, that increased their value.
Yeah. So here let me throw it.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say that's a little different than what happens in the Thaler experiments, because in the Thaler experiments, there's no time elapses. They give the people the mugs, and then they immediately ask them, now how much would you need to part with it? So there's no time to become attached to the mugs.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, these glasses and I have been through a lot together.
Yeah. Yeah, you're reminding me, now you're just like bringing back bad memories, because you're reminding me of how I got a very expensive pair of Maui Jim sunglasses. And then one day I'm out running wearing them. I'm out of the house for like no more than like 2 minutes. And all of a sudden I feel a sharp pain at my temple, and I like swat at my temple. I knock the glasses to the ground, and sure enough, there's a dead bee lying there. It just stung me on the temple. But in the effort to get rid of the bee, I knocked my glasses to the ground and broke them.
Oh. Now it's all cascading back. Now we're just spinning into self-pity.
Yeah, see, this is just misery. Yeah, exactly. Thinking about that, it's like, oh, the loss is coming back.
Yeah. The other weird thing was I thought that maybe Oakley would replace them, and I only had them for a couple of months, and so I went on the website and filled out the form and sent in pictures, and they said, yeah, we can repair them for 103 euros, and I was like, no way, like that's way too much. So,
right.
Like, I'd rather buy new ones for 130 than get an identical replacement for 103, which I don't understand at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so apparently they were reparable. So, but yeah, I don't know. I went through that sort of thing once, where you think if you lost a valuable object that somebody should be just willing to replace it for you, but no, it's like you got to bear your loss yourself. I mean, unless you got insurance. If you got insurance, then somebody else is bearing it for you.
Yeah, and my wife keeps reminding me that, well, it saved your eye. Like it took the hit. Like I landed pretty hard.
It was your screensaver. Yeah, or your screen protector for your phone, right? Yeah.
Right.
Good point.
All right, so let's talk about this idea about maximizing what happens. Like, why is that a bad thing? I know 50 years, 70 years of economics says that this is the way to happiness. Why isn't it? This idea of maximizing subject to constraints.
Yeah, I think that it describes some things that we actually need to do as humans, or more broadly, that animals need to do, that other organisms need to do. So, like, for example, as I mentioned in the piece, if you're a cheetah, okay, and you're not basically, maximizing, the amount of gazelles or springboks that you kill, subject to your energy, that you have at your expense and the length of the day, you're not going to survive. Okay, so you basically have to do the best you can. You have to be maximizing. And similarly, if you're a human being living in a subsistence situation, like you're in subsistence agriculture, if you want to survive, you really have to kind of maximize. And even if you're not in a subsistence situation, you better work pretty hard if you want to keep a job, and you better make good decisions. If you don't want to lose all your money. But so these are things that we have to do. And so I think economists are right that to a certain extent we need to live by sort of a maximizing way of being. But the thing is, we're doing this, because we have to, but it's not the way to happiness. We're not doing this because this is what makes us happier. But the funny thing is that economists seem to actually confound this. They say they've developed this theory of behavior, but they call it a theory of satisfaction. They say, they talk about sort of maximizing your satisfaction. And I don't think that this is how people get to be, truly satisfied.
Well, just the word satisfaction feels like it's a contradiction of maximization. Like if I'm satisficing, it's the opposite of optimizing or maximizing.
Yeah, satisficing, that term satisficing, which was, by the way, invented by Herbert Simon, who is kind of an early behavioral economist, is this notion of getting to a certain level of satisfaction. And he used to describe firm behavior, that instead of maximizing profits, firms would just get a satisfactory amount of revenue and just leave it at that, or a satisfactory amount of profits. And then that was going to be good enough. So that's a very, that's a kind of a term of art. But I think that the idea, so if you're thinking about maximizing, again, what we're talking about maximizing utility, that's essentially maximizing satisfactions. Like I'm trying to maximize my happiness subject to my constraints. But when you go through this process, if you actually lived the way economists said, sort of get and spend and do this kind of thing, you're not going to, I don't think you're going to be very happy. And for a couple of reasons. One is that our satisfaction is often positional. So people are, when they think about things, if they frame life as being about sort of having certain things and that being the basis for satisfaction, we generally tend to be satisfied if the things that we have are better than what we see other people have, or at least as good. So like, if you think, hey, I'll be happy if I get a $3 million house, you're probably, that's going to be true if it's larger than the house that your neighbors have. But now if $3 million is no longer the standard, if everybody's getting $4 million houses, then you're going to be pretty unhappy. And so a lot of what people pursue when they're pursuing things like this is a positional situation.
Right. And the most toys.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Right.
It's the most toys relative to other people. Okay. I mean, suppose you and I each have one car. Okay. So we've got a certain level of happiness. Now imagine we both have 5 cars. I think what and the author Robert Frank wrote about this in Luxury Fever, and also to some degree this is in Juliet Schor's The Overspent American, that Frank argues that really research shows that when both of us have 5 cars, we're really not much happier, if at all, okay, because we still look over at each other and we're like, hey, I'm just kind of exactly where my neighbor is. And a lot of this satisfaction, at least when it comes to material goods, has to do with relative position. Okay. Juliet Schor talks, she's the other economist I talk about in the piece. She comes at it a slightly different way. She doesn't talk so much about positional considerations, but more about just kind of what people internalize as representing the good life. And she says this notion of what constitutes a good life has ratcheted upwards over time.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it, but someone said like the definition of success for a man is to make more money than his brother-in-law.
Yeah, that's it. That's the Bob Frank idea. That's the idea in Robert Frank's work.
Yeah. So it feels like there's something biological about that, and maybe like all things that get skewed in our society and by economists, but this idea of being hyper aware of our status in a group, in terms of access to resources, in terms of influence over others. So I wonder if there's something hardwired in us that makes us say, like, here I am in Spain with a apartment that's about a third the size of my house that I sold in North Carolina. And there's ways in which, like, boy, I really wish I had a garage to store all my crap. And they're like, oh, I don't have any crap anymore. I sold it all. and there's something like, this is, it's smaller, but it's nicer that I can see another apartment there across the street that's not as nice as mine because I have a better view. And
which I'm not saying has to matter for you. I mean, in fact, one of the points of the piece is that you can, if you frame your life differently, your goals differently, it doesn't have to be about relative position.
But I think it takes some effort, at least for me. Like right now, I'm looking at it's raining out. There's a guy sitting in the balcony of an apartment in the other building that we looked at when we were shopping around, and our realtor told us it was ours, and then we came and she said, "I'm so sorry, something glitched. It's taken." And Mia and I were like, "Okay, well, breathe. We're going to decide that this means that wasn't the place for us."
Right.
And then this place opened up, which is better in every way.
Okay, great.
So I look at that place and I go, yeah. Like I'm, it's complicated, but I'm definitely
still getting satisfaction from this.
Yes, I definitely get satisfaction from looking at that other apartment that I'm not in.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so is this biological? Actually, this is very interesting because Robert Frank talks about this as well in one of his books. I'm not sure if it's in Luxury Fever, although he probably touches on it in Luxury Fever. But there's this example he gives of, I think it's elk. Okay. So elk, as you may know, have antlers. Okay. And they actually, some elk have very big racks of antlers and some not so big. But what happened is over time, I think we're talking about elk and not some other kind of species, but let's assume it's elk. So what happens is that in order for a male elk to propagate its genes, it needs to find a mate. And the male elk fight each other for the desirable mates. Okay. And as you might guess, the one with the bigger rack of antlers wins. Okay. So what happens is that we see that the evolution has favored elk with larger and larger antlers. Okay. But this is actually not good for the species, because when the antlers are larger, the damage to other elks is greater. And so we have more elks being killed in combat. All right. And so it adversely affects the population. Now, Robert Frank calls this smart for one, dumb for all. Okay. So this adaptation has been favored by natural selection because indeed it favors, that's kind of the way natural selection works. The genome is favored that can survive and propagate, but it has not been good for elk population. So we have this kind of weird, sort of anomalous case where natural selection has in some sense worked against the elks themselves.
Well, I think I would also want to distinguish between sexual selection and predatory selection.
Yes.
Right. So if the elk with the big antlers can't run as fast and they're being chased by wolves or humans, or they're bumping into trees, or they've got constant,
and
cervical pain.
I think in fact that's something that Robert Frank mentions. Is now that you come to think of it, I think that one reason those elks do worse is that they're getting stuck in trees and they can't run as fast, and that gets to be a problem. But yet they're able to propagate. So I guess the thing is, on balance, if those two things were working for and against the individual, that could all balance out.
Yeah.
But it's when they work against the species that you have this sort of interesting phenomenon of, okay, now nature has favored this trait, and now it might actually doom the species. It's not going to, I don't think it will doom the elk species, but that has happened. That sort of thing has happened.
See, here's where I'm going with this. I'm thinking that, the classic example of sort of species at war with each other who support each other, or so, let's say, caribou and wolves, where the wolves, in order to maximize, are going to go after the easiest caribou, the slowest, the oldest, the sick, whatever. Yeah. And that makes the caribou species better. And the caribou are always going to get better, which means that the wolves have to continually get faster and smarter. And I'm wondering if the problem with the elk is that somehow, because maybe humans killed all their predators, that they're no longer in an open system, and that it's closed systems that allow maximization to scale to the point where it's good for one and bad for all. Whether in an environment where there's true, like open loops, whether no species could ever attain a place where they were, evolving against their best interests or acting against their collective best interests.
It's possible. I mean, I don't know about the case of elks, but it's certainly possible that humans coming onto the scene, and it's not just possible, we know it's true. Humans coming onto the scene affect the outcomes in these, sort of evolutionary situations. And there's a certain tendency to think of humans as being the destabilizing force, but a lot of these things happen even without humans. I mean, there's no guarantee that natural selection is going to lead to a good outcome for species in the long run. Species develop these things that end up, these various traits that end up dooming them in the end. And it's not like, nature has any stake in this. Nature kind of just shrugs and says, okay, well, that's what happened. So too bad for them. We'll go on with what's left. And so, but no, humans are on the scene now, and we are seeing a decrease in biodiversity. And there's some serious concerns about that, at least that we have, that if we believe there should be as diverse an ecosystem as there has been prior to humans existing. Does nature care? I mean, does God care? That's I don't know. Nature seems to shrug no matter what happens, but I think we care.
All right. So I want to talk to you about King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Because I somehow, for some reason, there was a poster of this band up in my garage in North Carolina. I suspect one of my children put it there.
Really?
I had never heard of them, but I was curious, so I went on Spotify, and I had exactly the same reaction that you had. Like, where is this going?
Did you look at the discography? Did you see how many albums they have?
I didn't. No.
It is crazy. It's crazy. So they have two 2023 albums, okay, and then you scroll back to 2022, and they have like 8 of them or something. It's ridiculous. How do they produce so much stuff? It's amazing. They're just incredibly prolific band. But no, you've heard of them. It sounds like you heard of them much earlier than I did. I really discovered them within the past year. And it's just because somebody I follow on Twitter who's from Australia said, hey, we have this great Australian band that you may want to check out. And I kind of ignored that suggestion for several months. And then for whatever reason, I can't remember how I came across them again. And I actually, no, I think I listened to one of the albums that he recommended and I didn't like that album. But then I went back and I listened to some other albums and one of the ones, the song that I mentioned in the piece. And at first, again, it was kind of really strange stuff. But then I just kind of let it. I was like, okay, give it a chance. And it was kind of in some ways transformative for my taste. It surprised me is what it did.
Yeah, and so you said that at a certain point you looked out the window and saw the wind blowing through the trees, and you felt things, and you stood there like this was a moment that was kind of the opposite of maximizing subject to constraints, right? So, what was it, and what did it mean to you?
Yeah. Okay. So that experience that I had in my kitchen early on, this is like when I really was just discovering King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, was occurred, I think, because I had lost my reference point. Okay. So normally we go about our lives where we have our satisfaction is determined to some degree based upon reference points. So we've kind of, I'll talk about what that means in a minute. But we talked before about position, relative position, that I feel good about, you feel good about your apartment in Barcelona because it looks better than the one you can see out your window, right?
Right.
So that's a reference point phenomenon, okay? The reference point that you have for deciding how you feel about your apartment is your neighbor's apartment, okay? But that's only one kind of reference point phenomenon. We also tend to feel happy if we're happier than we have been recently. So if you've been through a tough time and then it passes, you can have a feeling of euphoria, right? Mm-hmm. So you have that kind of temporal reference point. And so reference points are very important for us for our determining our how we feel, sort of hedonically, how we feel in terms of satisfaction. But also people use them for decision making. So it's been shown that Uber drivers, for example, rideshare drivers will set a reference point. They'll set a certain amount of money they want to make for the day. And when they get that amount of money, they quit. Okay. And that may sound, not terribly surprising, except that it violates what economists say people should do, which is they should be profit maximizing if they're firms. Okay. Mm-hmm. These Uber drivers are not profit maximizing. They drive like hell until they hit their reference point and then they quit. Okay. So that's not explained by traditional economic behavior, but reference points explain it.
And I think there was some.
Yeah, go ahead.
There was some issue with the rideshare drivers where they were not maximizing anything with this behavior because on the good days, right, they could take entire days off if they know it's going to be a slow day. Like a bad day, they'd work 12 hours, and a good day, they'd work 3.
Exactly. Have you read the paper?
I don't know where I got this. It might have been some behavior. Like who did the paper?
Yeah, Botan Kasegi and Matthew Rabin wrote the paper.
Definitely did not read the paper.
It's a journal article from 2006, I think. Okay. These are two great behavioral economists, both originally out of Berkeley. Rabin is now at Harvard and Kasegi is at Central European University. But anyway, So coming back, bringing this back to my being there in the kitchen, listening to King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Okay, so if you kind of go about your life doing things the same way, and not trying things that are new, you tend to develop habits, and you tend also to develop reference points that are very, very fixed and very obvious. And so, if I have, same thing for breakfast every morning, I have 2 eggs, it's going to satisfy me, but it's never going to be that exciting because it's what I do every day. And I kind of already have a reference point for it. And, things kind of revert to the average. And so your experience of life is going to be average if you don't shake it up. But when you do something that moves in a radically different direction, that surprises you, you lose your reference point. And I would argue it gives you the potential to have an experience which just completely takes control of you, just completely seizes you, because everything that you have to refer to, everything that you have as the basis for your prior experience is stripped away, and you have no choice but to take what you're experiencing at face value. So when I listen to this 20-minute long track by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, this song was 20 minutes long, okay? And I'm not like a big jam band fan. I'd never really had thought about jam bands. But I was listening to this and I was like, okay, just stay with it. And because it was so strange, maybe it focused my attention more. And while that was happening, at the same time, I was also kind of aware of what was going on outside. It was a windy day, and I saw the wind in the trees, and I could feel the wind coming through the window, and I could hear the rustling in the leaves. And because I was present for the music, I was also present for these things as well. And there was kind of a way in which they all came together and clicked for me. And I suddenly realized, that I was in this moment that was where I was very much there, and it just kind of stretched out. It's hard to put into words, but I had this, very present experience of the moment.
It's reminding me, and I don't know if this is right or not, but it's reminding me of our first conversation in which we talked about stocks and flows, and that you kind of came down on the side of experiences rather than material objects as better stores of capital or better uses of capital.
Better uses of your time. I mean, yeah, so I was talking with you about my pending book, Capital Actually, and this notion of stocks and flows that I talk about in the book. And you're absolutely right. This is sort of another way of framing what is more or less the same thing, that stocks of capital, are sort of our reference points in some sense. I look at myself in the mirror and I say, hey, I've got these characteristics, I'm in good shape, or I'm smart, or or you think about your identity. I'm a professor, I'm a father, I'm these things. And when you look at those things, they're reference points for understanding yourself and experiencing the world. And the more focused you are on these things that the less open you are to everything else that is out there. When you forget about these stocks of capital and just kind of experience the moment, with awareness and openness, a lot more can happen, or a lot more that you're aware of can happen. And so I think that ties in directly on a certain level to what I'm talking about in that book.
So it's almost like there's a risk of not having your 2 eggs in the morning because you could have oatmeal and hate it. But there's a sort of a meta benefit to being a risk-taking sort of person, to say, I'm going to try these experiences that I may not like in the moment. I may not want to listen to 20 minutes of jam band music. But the bigger picture is kind of opening me up to experiences that I would not have otherwise.
There is a 100% risk involved there and potential benefit. And another way in which I've talked about this same phenomenon, again, in another Substack piece called Travel Can Be Psychedelic, is the notion of travel. Travel is another way for us to shake the snow globe, if you will. when you get out of your normal situation, wherever it is that you live, and just plunk yourself down somewhere else in the world, unless you like line everything up to be exactly the way you're used to, you're giving yourself the opportunity to give up your reference point, to just have the carpet pulled out from under you and just find your way wherever it is you are. And that can be frustrating, scary, and also incredible.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that if you don't do it proactively, life is going to do it to you some way or other.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Things happen. And and it's actually, because that's the case, it's actually one way that we can look at crisis, is that when something terrible happens, it can be an opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Every day I'm like, no opportunities today, please.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Please, no opportunities. Yeah. I mean, no. I mean, we don't wish bad things on people, but those things are going to happen anyway. And meanwhile, what we can do is, in a more, in a less cataclysmic way, we can put ourselves into surprises, into surprise situations, and invite.
It's an inoculation, right?
In some sense, yeah. I mean, because that's an interesting way of looking at it. I don't think I've argued in any of these pieces that that's really why you should do this. I argue that the reason you want to lose your reference point is because it improves your, immediate experience. It almost sounds like when you say inoculation, that you're talking about, hey, this is an opportunity to create a capital stock. Okay. By getting myself in these situations where I'm constantly surprised, I'm actually learning how to deal with surprises and crises and so on and so forth. I guess that's an added benefit, but I'm not, I wasn't even suggesting that's the reason. Yeah.
Well, I would say it's a chance to loosen your hold on a capital stock, which is your identity.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with that.
Like, who are you when you're listening to this weird music, looking at your window at the wind? Like, you're nobody. You're part of, right? Who cares if you're a professor or a father or a breadwinner or whatever?
Yeah, you're part of the whole. You're part of, Gaia, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you've read Asimov, or even if you haven't.
Yeah.
But no, exactly.
So,
yeah. I mean, I think losing your sense of who you are can be, can be helpful. I mean, because I think in a lot of ways our notion of self can be limiting. I love the way Walt Whitman said, "I contain multitudes," and I like to think of myself that way. I like to describe myself that way because it's, I feel like any way that I would otherwise characterize myself is limiting. And I always, if I say, hey, I'm an economics professor who's kind of interested in X, Y, and Z, I would look at that kind of written down on paper, and I would say, okay, can I have the opportunity not to be that, or can I not to be that, but to be something more than that? Okay. So I think that forgetting who you are is ultimately all, and it gives you more opportunity to broaden your experience of life.
Yeah, and I think it's a clue that the evolutionary drive toward reproduction, the momentary reward is losing yourself.
Yeah, right. That, taking hard drugs. I mean, getting alcohol. People are trying to lose themselves, but there are other ways to get there, and you can one way is also through meditation and through other disciplines, and actually more broadly through being really focused on the activity that you're engaged in at the moment. If you're doing something that is so engrossing, you lose yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or just to be aware of your life, right? Like I don't know about you. I remember about 3 hours of high school. Like, I know I went through thousands of hours of high school. I haven't calculated, basically 8 hours times 180 times, well, for us 3, but for most people 4. I remember very little of it. I remember getting beat up by the football team, but that was junior high.
Right.
I remember a fire drill in which Jeff Barry held me and Michael Rothberg up by the ankles for 5 minutes until the bell rang.
Oh, I watched that happen. Yeah.
and I remember, some of your performances in various, musical performances in various classes. But
Yeah, I've tried.
I don't like the vast majority, 99.9%. Like somehow I wasn't there because I don't remember it, and I'm sure there was a lot of fun stuff that happened because I have a very good body memory of like this was a fun time. But I don't know what happened.
You're giving me the opportunity to allude to just about every piece I've ever written in Substack, because this now brings us to a different one in which I talk about concrete experiences. I mean, we don't remember everything that happens because we tend to abstract our past. We remember only things that have a certain meaning that we've assigned to them. But as you experience a moment, it's concrete, it's holistic. It's got a lot more packed into it than you'll ever be able to remember in most cases. And that, I think, is one of the kind of fascinating tensions, is like we experience a lot in each moment of life if we're willing to just experience it in that moment at face value and not feel like we have to assign meaning to it and not feel like we have to create a memory out of it. Because ultimately our memories are going to be limited. We're going to look back and we may not remember some of those incredible moments. But I don't know, I come down on this. We've talked about this to some degree, the question of remembered experience versus experience in the moment. I kind of come down on the side of just experiencing whether you're going to remember it or not.
Right. Right. Which is a good place to end. I was so thrilled to read the end of the piece and to see that you quoted one of my favorite songs, Spring Wind.
Wow, you know that song.
I don't know anybody who knows like the deep tracks of Greg Brown. And I think that's the same song that has, we burned our love letters so the children won't be shocked.
That's right. Yep.
Which is
an old couple burning their love letters so their children won't be shocked.
But like, what a glorious song. So what did, tell us about Spring Wind.
So this is the way I was trying to figure out a way to end this piece. And I said, I kind of brought it back around to the original question. I said, listen, here I am. I'm an economist. And I've just rejected, the way economists look at the way we should be living our lives. And I was like, so if maximizing subject to constraints isn't it, I mean, doesn't that sound like that should be it? I mean, if we can't just reduce life to a formula where it's like, hey, let's figure out what you want to do and then just try to get there, then what do you do? And as I'm sort of thinking about this, I realized that, okay, well, I mean, a plan can seem like a very strong thing and very powerful, but there are things more powerful plans, and that is just things that happen. Like when you have a plan and the wind just picks it up and blows it away, and you're like, there go my plans, And the amazing thing is, in as much as like you lose your list of things to do, that can feel like, oh, I created this, I've just lost something. On the other hand, it's freed you. And so, that's, I think, kind of the message of that song. The spring wind just blew my list of things to do away. It's the way in which a spring day can just kind of set you free.
I love it. And as with everything else, it's a balance and it's nested. I'm thinking about like video games, which, you might argue or is not a way to maximize your economic life. And yet a lot of video games, like the fun of it is you're maximizing within that little universe, right? You're getting points, creating levels, gaining experience points, or,
I mean,
whatever.
Not just playing a game like that, but being on Twitter. I mean, you're accumulating followers, right? You're getting likes.
Yeah, kudos to you for still being on that cesspool. I guess there's I see your posts and people, you're actually responding. Like there's a small group of people you're like huddled in a bunker saying we still want to be here.
Yeah, there's people that I still like. Yeah, there's a few good economists and some other people. Yeah.
So cool. Well, I'm looking forward to your next piece. I'm looking forward to to our continued conversations. Any sort of pithy aphorism or summary of this particular body of thought that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I would just say, I think really the challenge, it's a daily challenge rather than sort of thinking about, starting the day. Think about how you start a day rather than just kind of starting the day thinking, I'm going to try and get all these things done, or I'm going to try to, maximize this particular objective. It's worth starting a day thinking, how can I just, right, not even starting the day, but just thinking right this moment, right now, how can I just go in a completely different direction from what I was even thinking about doing? And just see if you can step into that world. And personally, I can't do that very often, but when I do, when I actually pull it off, it's pretty cool. So I don't know if that's a big aphorism, but that's my advice.
That's great. It's even better. So I'm gonna put in the show notes links to Spring Wind, and if you could send me which track of King Gizzard you were listening to, I could put that in too, and people can have like an entirely immersive experience of this conversation.
Right, yeah, and they can decide if that song works for them. It's not going to work for everybody.
And that's the point.
Well, thank you, Howie. I really enjoyed this.
Me too. I look forward to our next one, and have a great day. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.
And that's a wrap. Show notes for today's episode available at plantyourself.com/589. This weekend, going to Burgos, Spain for the Second Division Grass Championships. Looking forward to playing with a really good team of Bravas from Barcelona there and see what I can contribute. The other thing I wanted to let you know is I am now leading workshops for teams on how to communicate better, how to perform better, how to raise their team effectiveness, and how to deal with conflicts that always will come up. Conflicts are inevitable, and when I work with my clients one-on-one, I show them and teach them and guide them and coach them and mentor them to be the person on their team who can uplift the team. And I thought, why not work with the entire team? So if you are in an organization and you run teams, or you know that there's a group that is having a little bit of trouble getting things done properly, or there's morale issues, reach out to me. You can do so from my practice website, askhowie.com. We can set up a conversation. We can do Zoom workshops, and I can also travel. So that's it for this week. As always, be well, my friends.